By the time Roderick Hayes accepted the night shift, 6 assistants had quit Whitaker Tower in 39 days. They blamed Celeste Whitaker, whose midnight demands and impossible standards had turned her penthouse into a graveyard of careers. Roderick needed the job, but he refused to fear her. That night, he immediately noticed what no one else had. Her medication log was altered, her emergency call button had been disconnected, and someone in her company wanted her helpless. When Celeste ordered him to leave before dawn, Roderick locked the door and said, "Not until you know who's trying to erase you. Stay with Roderick through the 7th night, when one hidden file will expose who turned Celeste's prison into a weapon." The assistant's desk outside the penthouse sat empty most evenings, a small monument to failure that nobody bothered to explain to new hires. Inside its bottom drawer were 6 employee badges, each left behind by someone who had lasted between 2 and 6 days before walking out for good. People in the building had started calling the top floor the career grave, and the story traveled fast. Celeste Whitaker called for her assistants at midnight, rearranged their schedules without warning, and fired people over mistakes so small they barely qualified as mistakes at all. Victor Halden, the company's chief operating officer, told anyone who would listen that Celeste simply needed someone who could tolerate her temperament, as if the problem began and ended with her personality. Human resources had stopped even trying to hide how desperate the listing had become, quietly raising the salary twice in less than 6 weeks, just to keep applicants interested long enough to interview. Recruiters warned candidates in advance that the position required nerves of steel, though none of them ever mentioned the deeper truth that steel nerves alone would never be enough to survive whatever was really happening on that floor. Roderick had read through the listing 3 times, before applying, noticing the phrase "requires resilience," repeated twice as though it were a warning rather than a job requirement. Roderick arrived at 7:45 in the evening, wearing a suit that was worn but pressed with obvious care, the kind of attention a man gives his clothes when he has learned that people judge him before he opens his mouth. The security guard at the entrance glanced at him once and pointed toward the loading dock, assuming without asking that a black man in a slightly dated suit belonged with the deliveries rather than the executives. When Roderick produced his offer letter, the guard still called upstairs to confirm his identity, and Victor let him stand there for nearly 20 minutes in full view of passing employees before finally coming down. Victor asked with a thin smile whether Roderick understood this was an executive assistant position and not overnight security, and Roderick answered evenly that Victor might want to read his file before deciding what he was capable of. Celeste sat in her glass-walled office, with her wheelchair angled toward the window facing the lit skyline of the city rather than the door. She did not offer her hand, and she did not offer a greeting. The first thing she gave Roderick was a schedule that bordered on impossible 34 meetings to reorganize 3 contracts, to summarize a full report due before 2 in the morning, and a standing rule that he was never to wake her, unless the building itself was on fire. She told him, without looking up, that he was free to leave his badge on the desk whenever he decided to quit the same way the others had. Roderick did not argue, and did not try to charm her. Instead, he asked 3 direct questions about priority order, about what access he actually had, and about which deadlines were real, and which were simply habit. Celeste found the questions irritating, mostly because none of the 6 before him had ever dared to ask anything at all. They had simply obeyed, and then collapsed under the weight of it. He finished the most critical parts of the schedule before midnight and pointed out that 2 meetings had been double-booked by an automated system update Celeste had never authorized. When she accused him of making excuses, he showed her the edit history, tracing the change to an administrative account that did not belong to him. As Celeste prepared to retire for the night, she asked him to leave the emergency call device within reach of her bed, a habit built from 2 years of learning to trust very little. Roderick checked it out of pure instinct and discovered the internal wire had been deliberately disconnected from the building's central system, not from ordinary wear, but from a clean, intentional cut. He asked when the device had last been serviced, and Celeste answered that Victor had sent someone to replace it only 2 days earlier. Neither of them said the word sabotage out loud, but the air in the room had already changed, and Roderick understood before his first shift ended that whatever was happening on that floor was not simply the temper of a difficult woman. Late that night, sorting through the shared assistant inbox to prepare tomorrow's files, Roderick found a resignation letter, already drafted and saved, addressed from his own account, though he had never typed a word of it. The letter claimed he could not handle Celeste's unreasonable demands and unstable moods, phrased in language that echoed the 5 resignation letters before it almost word for word. He did not show it to Celeste that first night, since he had nothing but a suspicion and a saved draft, but he quietly recorded the file's creation timestamp and the login credentials attached to it before closing his laptop for the morning. The strange resignation letter had been saved in the Assistant Accounts Drafts folder, written in a tone that sounded almost rehearsed, blaming Roderick for reactions he had never had and demands Celeste had never actually made. The phrasing matched the pattern of every resignation before his, as though all 6 had been written from the same template by the same hand. Roderick chose not to confront anyone yet, since a saved draft alone proved nothing. But he began quietly documenting every irregularity he found, building a private record that no one else knew existed. The first real test of trust came over something small. Celeste asked him to retrieve a folder from a high shelf, and when her wheelchair caught on the edge of a rug, Roderick did not reach for the chair on instinct, the way every assistant before him apparently had. Instead, he asked her plainly whether she wanted him to move the chair or clear the rug, and the question caught her off guard enough that she paused before answering. She chose to clear the rug herself and reposition the chair on her own terms, and that small exchange did more to earn her trust than anything he had said all night. While organizing her files, Roderick noticed 2 different medication schedules sitting side by side, one signed by Dr. Phoebe Carlyle with clearly spaced dosage times, and one kept at the penthouse with the timing quietly shifted. The altered version left Celeste fatigued and unfocused during her earliest morning meetings, which happened to be the meetings Victor most often attended in her place. When Roderick raised the discrepancy, Celeste reacted sharply, accusing him of overstepping into medical matters that were none of his business. He did not diagnose her or suggest she change anything. He simply placed both schedules next to each other and asked her to call her doctor directly to confirm which one was real. Dr. Phoebe confirmed within the hour that she had never approved the second schedule and insisted that nothing already prepared should be used until every remaining dose was verified. Celeste began to feel the first cracks of genuine fear beneath her usual composure, though she covered it as always with coldness. She asked Roderick why he noticed things that everyone else seemed to overlook, and he told her plainly that in crisis management, small inconsistencies were almost always the first sign of a much larger disaster waiting to happen. Near 3 a.m, Celeste suddenly ordered Roderick to leave, insisting she did not need to be watched like a child. He told her calmly that he was not there to control her, then set a backup radio, a working phone, and the newly repaired call button within her reach before retreating to the outer room, leaving the door open exactly the way she preferred. For the first time in months, Celeste fell asleep without gripping her phone in her hand through the night. Somewhere in the small hours, Roderick also discovered that a board meeting originally titled Emergency Succession Planning, scheduled for the morning of the 8th day, had quietly vanished from Celeste's calendar, deleted from an Everteen account that belonged to Victor alone. Victor let himself into the penthouse at 2:13 in the morning despite having told colleagues earlier that day he was traveling in another city entirely. Victor claimed he had returned early and simply wanted to check on Celeste, though his irritation at finding Roderick still awake and working was obvious. He asked Roderick to step out so he could speak with the CEO privately, and Roderick complied, but not before noticing Victor immediately reach for the medication tray and Celeste's tablet the moment the door closed. When Victor left, a file that had been open on that tablet only minutes earlier was gone without a trace. Celeste defended him fiercely. Once Roderick raised the visit the next evening, insisting Victor had run the company almost single-handedly in the chaotic months after her accident, managing the press, the investors, and thousands of employees while she recovered. She did not want to believe the one person who had stayed by her side through everything could be capable of betrayal. Roderick did not accuse Victor outright. He simply told her that loyalty did not require hiding board meetings or quietly rewriting a medication chart behind her back. Reviewing the handoff notes left by the 6 previous assistants, Roderick found a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. One had been blamed for losing critical files, another for sending a confidential email to the wrong recipient, a third for missing an important investor, call a fourth accused of stealing internal data, a fifth accused of lying about medication timing, and the sixth had simply quit after a mysterious blackout on his very first week. Every single incident traced back to access permissions controlled directly through Victor's office. Celeste decided to test Roderick herself, handing him a secret assignment to prepare 2 versions of a financial report, each containing a slightly different figure, with only the 2 of them aware of which version was correct. The next morning, Victor sent a critical email attacking Roderick for using the exact figure Celeste had privately chosen, proving beyond doubt that Victor was somehow monitoring documents inside the penthouse that he had no legitimate reason to see. Searching through old personnel records, Roderick found contact information for Quinn Barlow, one of the assistants who had lasted only 4 nights before disappearing from the company entirely. Quinn initially refused to speak, having once been threatened with a lawsuit worth $500,000 over an alleged breach of confidentiality. Roderick did not push. He simply sent an image of the pre-written resignation letter, and Quinn recognized the language instantly as nearly identical to the letter that had once carried Quinn's own name. Quinn finally admitted to once seeing Victor quietly download a file labeled Continuity shortly before every access credential in the building was mysteriously reset. Celeste began to doubt her own memory as the picture darkened around her. She confessed that for months she had woken with fragments of decisions she did not remember making, documents bearing her electronic signature that she had no recollection of ever approving. Victor had always explained it away as a side effect of her medication, a small mental fog that would pass with time. Roderick offered her a single steadying truth. Not remembering something did not mean she had actually done it. Hallway security footage later confirmed that Victor had entered the penthouse on all 6 nights, immediately preceding each assistant's resignation, a pattern too precise to be dismissed as coincidence any longer. Roderick built a quiet trap, using 2 separate activity logs, one kept entirely offline, as the real record, and one deliberately planted with a fabricated meeting designed to lure out whoever had access they should not have had. Within 3 hours, Victor issued instructions to cancel that exact fabricated meeting, and Celeste could no longer pretend her systems had not been compromised from the inside. That same night, Celeste finally spoke about the accident that had changed everything 2 years earlier. Before it, she had built her company entirely on her own terms, answering to no one and asking permission from nobody. After it, everyone around her had begun speaking more slowly, making decisions on her behalf and calling it protection when it was really control. She was not afraid of the wheelchair itself. She was afraid of people using it as an excuse to decide who she was allowed to be. Roderick shared a piece of his own history in return, explaining that he had once managed emergency operations for a large logistics company, responsible for more than 200 employees, before he stepped away to raise his son alone after his wife's death. When his son eventually grew into an independent adult, Roderick tried to return to leadership roles, only to be told again and again that he had been out of management for too long to be trusted with real responsibility. He had taken the assistant position, not because he lacked the skill for something greater, but because he refused to keep waiting for someone else's permission to start rebuilding his life. Victor tried a different tactic, summoning Roderick to his private office and sliding across a resignation agreement worth $50,000. The terms were simple: leave immediately, sign a confidentiality clause, and confirm in writing that Celeste displayed unstable and erratic behavior. Victor implied, not so subtly, that a man like Roderick would never be trusted by the board over a long-time executive, and that the money on the table was more than he would ever earn doing what Victor called service work. Roderick did not raise his voice or make a scene. He read every clause carefully and asked why Victor needed a signature at all if Celeste's instability were truly self-evident. For a brief moment, Victor's composure slipped. Roderick left the pen untouched on the contract and told him plainly that his self-respect was not for sale at whatever price Victor happened to place on the table. Victor's parting warning was cold and precise. He reminded Roderick that the six before him had also believed they could win, and he promised that by the morning of the seventh day, no one in that building would believe a word Roderick said. It was only later replaying the conversation that Roderick realized the upcoming board meeting was not simply about replacing a CEO. It was a deadline for something far larger that Victor intended to finish before anyone could stop him. Celeste overheard part of that exchange through the penthouse intercom system, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she watched someone turn down a fortune simply to protect her right to know the truth. The fifth night began with a violent storm rolling over the city, and without warning, the penthouse's entire backup power system failed. The building's main generators kicked in everywhere, except the penthouse itself, which remained dark while the rest of the tower hummed with electricity. Celeste's motorized wheelchair sat uselessly plugged into its charger, unusable in the moment she needed it most. The electronic locks, the automated curtains, the landline, and every voice-controlled system in her home went silent at once, and her personal phone carried only a sliver of battery left. She was trapped inside her own bedroom when the electronic lock jammed shut, unable to reach Victor, no matter how many times she tried. Roderick used an emergency mechanical kit to force the lock open by hand, careful never to touch her chair or lift her without asking first. He explained each option calmly, offering her the choice between a manual backup chair or waiting for rescue crews to arrive, and she chose the backup chair on her own terms. Shortly afterward, Celeste grew dizzy and short of breath, following a dose from medication that had already been prepared for her that evening. Roderick called Dr. Phoebe, immediately reading off the exact label and timing so there could be no confusion, and the doctor realized at once that two medications had been combined in a way she had never authorized. Roderick followed every instruction, precisely keeping Celeste conscious and monitored, calling for emergency medical help, and refusing to administer anything further on his own judgment. Paramedics arrived in time, and Celeste stabilized. Though her fury only deepened once, she understood that her own medication tray had been deliberately tampered with. Once she was safe, Roderick and a building technician traced the outage to a secondary electrical room where the penthouse breaker had been manually locked into the off position, accessible only to someone holding senior administrative clearance. Access logs showed Victor's badge opening that very room 2 hours before the storm ever hit, and an invoice for a supposed generator inspection had been signed under the name of a company that did not exist anywhere in public. Records. Back inside the penthouse, Celeste handed Roderick the encrypted key to her private data vault, admitting she had kept it hidden since the accident, but could no longer fully recall the complete password. Roderick did not simply take it from her hand. He asked whether she was certain and how far she wanted his access to extend, and that careful respect for her boundaries told her more clearly than anything he could have said that he was nothing like Victor. Celeste finally asked why he had stayed after nearly being dragged into real danger over the course of a single night. He told her the others had not left because they were weak. They left because they had been deliberately isolated, until staying became impossible. She admitted quietly that she had pushed away everyone who ever tried to help her, because she assumed they only saw pity when they looked at her. Roderick answered that he felt no pity toward her at all. What he felt was anger, because someone was clearly exploiting the very isolation she had been forced into. Deep inside the recovered vault, they found a deleted folder labeled Continuity, scheduled to activate on the morning of the 8th day. Using the offline backup he had quietly built over the previous nights, Roderick managed to restore much of the deleted folder's contents. On its surface, Continuity was framed as a standard contingency plan meant to protect the company should its chief executive ever become unfit to lead. Beneath that framing, the documents told a very different story, one that had clearly been prepared months in advance, a declaration questioning Celeste's competence, a forged resignation letter, a prepared list of board members expected to vote her out, a transfer agreement for the company's core patents, and a compensation package worth tens of millions of dollars, payable directly to Victor. The heart of the plan was a deal to sell Whitaker Systems' most valuable patents to an investment firm called North Star Equity for $2.1 billion, far below what the technology was actually worth. Celeste had rejected this exact offer once before, well before her accident. After the sale, the company would almost certainly be broken apart, putting thousands of jobs at risk, and Victor needed Celeste legally declared incompetent before he could sign the agreement in her place. Every one of the 6 former assistants, it turned out, had accidentally stumbled onto a single fragment of that same plan. A secret meeting on someone's calendar, a falsified invoice, a resignation letter. No one remembered writing a forged signature, a tampered medical record, an unexplained late-night access log. Victor had quietly sabotaged their work, provoked Celeste's anger toward each of them in turn, and then used fear and legal threats to keep every one of them silent afterward. Without realizing it, Celeste herself had become the instrument that pushed each witness out the door. Quinn agreed at last to help, sending screenshots of an email in which Victor demanded the deletion of a call log involving company counsel Russell Fenwick. Quinn also provided a time-stamped record showing Victor accessing Celeste's own account late at night while she was asleep. Even so, Quinn was afraid to come forward publicly. Rather than pressure Quinn into anything Roderick arranged for Russell, to offer full legal protection to every former assistant, and Celeste agreed to cover their legal costs and formally clear every false accusation from their personnel files. Facing the truth was painful for Celeste. She wanted to say the medication and Victor's manipulation excused everything she had done, but Roderick reminded her that being manipulated could explain her behavior without erasing her responsibility for it. She decided quietly and firmly that the very first thing she would do once she reclaimed her company would be to apologize to each of them in person. Together, Roderick, Celeste, and Russell agreed not to confront Victor too soon. They needed the board meeting to move forward as planned, forcing him to present his falsified documents out in the open where they could be exposed. Russell began preparing an emergency injunction to freeze the pending transaction. Dr. Phoebe prepared a formal medical statement, confirming Celeste remained fully capable of making her own decisions. Roderick backed up every piece of evidence in 3 separate, independent locations, refusing to let a single point of failure destroy everything they had gathered. The very next morning, internal security reported an item worth $180,000 missing from the penthouse, and doctored footage appeared to show Roderick himself carrying it out of Celeste's private quarters. When Roderick returned to the penthouse that evening, 4 security officers surrounded him before he could say a single word. They did not ask for an explanation. They simply ordered him to face the wall. Victor stood behind them, announcing loudly that Roderick had exploited a disabled executive in order to steal from her. Roderick remained composed, calmly requesting legal counsel, and asking that the original unedited footage be reviewed before anyone drew conclusions. The humiliation played out in full view of the staff gathering in the hallway. One guard referred to him dismissively as the outside hire, insisting he had no real place on the executive floor at all. They handcuffed him despite his complete lack of resistance, and Victor used the spectacle to reinforce the narrative that Roderick had been manipulating a vulnerable CEO from the very beginning. Somewhere in the crowd, Beatrice stood frozen near the service corridor, watching a man who had never once raised his voice, being treated like a criminal, and hating herself for staying silent even a moment longer. It was without question the lowest and most infuriating moment before everything finally turned. Celeste appeared at the penthouse door just as the scene reached its peak. Victor told her in front of everyone to go back inside and let the people with real authority handle the matter. That single sentence made it impossible for her to keep pretending Victor still saw her as anything other than helpless. She demanded the handcuffs be removed immediately. The head of security refused, claiming the order had come directly from the chief operating officer and legal counsel. Celeste reminded him coldly that she remained the chief executive and the largest shareholder in the very building he worked inside. The missing item was quickly discovered inside Roderick's personal locker, though the locker could only be opened using his own employee badge. Access records proved the locker had been opened at a moment when Roderick was verifiably with Dr. Phoebe elsewhere in the building. 11 minutes of hallway footage had been conveniently erased. Finally, Beatrice Duval stepped forward and admitted she had personally seen a member of Victor's staff enter the employee area during that exact window of time. Russell arrived and announced with full authority that Roderick was participating in an internal investigation, formally authorized by the chief executive herself. He demanded every camera and device on that floor be preserved immediately. The handcuffs came off, though Victor still insisted he intended to press charges. Roderick did not walk away. He requested that it be officially recorded that he had been restrained on the basis of evidence that had never actually been verified. In front of dozens of gathered employees, Celeste apologized publicly for allowing her own company's systems to treat Roderick like a criminal before anyone had bothered to examine the facts. It was not a quiet apology offered to protect her public image. It was a direct order to suspend the head of security and open an independent investigation into what had just happened. Roderick accepted her apology, but told her plainly that the matter would not be resolved simply because one man had been suspended. That same night, Celeste's smart wheelchair system was remotely locked without warning. Her screen displayed a message announcing that administrative control had been transferred to an interim chief executive. Victor had begun activating the continuity plan far earlier than anyone had expected. With barely 8 hours remaining before the board convened, Celeste found herself locked out of her company, locked out of her email, and locked out of the very chair that connected her to the rest of her world. For a brief, exhausted moment, Celeste wanted to give up entirely. She told Roderick he should take the evidence and leave the building before he was blamed for something even worse than a stolen bracelet. Roderick refused to walk away, but he also refused to decide anything for her. He asked her directly whether she wanted to fight or whether she simply wanted him to help her get out safely, and Celeste chose to fight. Roderick disconnected the remote control module from her wheelchair and switched it over to a local manual mode. He did not transform overnight into some impossible technical genius. His years managing logistics had given him a working understanding of backup systems, and the finer technical guidance came from a maintenance worker he trusted completely. Celeste regained full manual control of her own chair, and the moment carried a weight far beyond the mechanics of it. She was reclaiming her ability to move under her own power before she had even begun reclaiming her company. Victor cut the internet connection to the penthouse next, followed by every company-issued phone. Roderick fell back on an old landline that had never been tied into the cloud system at all. Russell confirmed the emergency injunction had already been filed. Quinn and 3 other former assistants agreed to join the coming meeting remotely through a private independent line that Victor had no way of touching. In a rare, unguarded moment, Celeste asked Roderick whether he thought she was a bad person underneath everything. He told her honestly that she had hurt people, but that she still held the power to decide who she chose to become now that the truth was finally visible to her. She confessed that she had quietly tested every single time the outer door closed whether he would actually walk away. Roderick answered that he had never stayed because he believed she could not survive without him. He stayed because no one deserved to be isolated to the point where someone else could freely rewrite the truth of their own life. There was no sudden kiss, no dramatic declaration of love. There was only a quiet stillness as Celeste rested her hand briefly on his arm, thanking him for never once touching her chair without asking first. He told her the chair was part of her own personal space, not a handle for someone else to steer. In that moment, the relationship shifted from executive and employee into something closer to 2, equals standing side by side. Victor had sealed off the main elevators, so Roderick and a technician forced open the service elevator using emergency operational clearance. Celeste guided herself inside under her own power. She wore the same suit she had worn on the day she first founded Whitaker Systems. Roderick walked beside her rather than behind her, refusing to push a chair that was hers alone to control. When the elevator doors opened onto the boardroom floor, Victor was already reading aloud. A prepared statement claiming Celeste had voluntarily resigned for reasons of health, with the directors preparing to vote him in as interim chief executive. The doors swung open fully. Celeste rolled into the room and announced in a voice that carried across the entire chamber that no one could resign from a room they had been deliberately locked out of. Victor placed in front of the board a document bearing what appeared to be Celeste's own biometric signature, seemingly proving that everything she had just claimed was nothing more than a lie. Victor's presentation painted a careful picture. Celeste, he claimed, could not reliably recall. Major decisions changed her schedule, erratically had driven away 6 qualified assistants, and had now fallen under the influence of a manipulative new hire. He called Roderick an opportunist who had exploited a disabled woman's loneliness for his own gain. Several directors immediately demanded that security remove Roderick from the room. A few of the older board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly more comfortable believing a familiar executive than trusting the composed stranger standing beside their founder. And for a long, tense moment, it seemed the entire room had already made up its mind before a single piece of evidence had been shown. Celeste stated firmly that Roderick was not present as her assistant. He was present as a witness to fraud and deliberate sabotage. Board Chair Lenora Beckett, still visibly skeptical, allowed him exactly 10 minutes to speak. Victor smiled, confident that a man without an executive title would never sway a room full of seasoned directors. Roderick laid out the evidence in careful, unbroken order. His own resignation letter had been drafted before he ever accepted the position. The 6 letters before his shared identical structure and matching metadata. The medication schedule had been altered from an account under Victor's direct control. The emergency call device had been deliberately disabled. Victor's badge had opened the electrical room hours before the outage began. Hallway footage had been erased at the exact moment the missing item was planted in his locker. The continuity file had been assembled before any legitimate medical evaluation of Celeste ever took place. And Victor's own compensation depended entirely on completing the sale to North Star Equity. One by one, the witnesses appeared. Dr. Phoebe confirmed there was no medical basis whatsoever for declaring Celeste incapable of making her own decisions. Quinn and the other former assistants appeared on screen, each describing an incident that had been deliberately manufactured against them. Beatrice confirmed that members of Victor's staff had repeatedly altered equipment inside the penthouse without Celeste's knowledge or consent. Russell presented the emergency injunction freezing the pending sale. Victor fought back, insisting every piece of evidence had been fabricated by Roderick himself, and he leaned hard on Roderick's employment gap in an attempt to discredit him entirely. Roderick did not defend his own resume. Instead, he asked Victor a single precise question. Why did the continuity file contain an electronic signature generated at the exact moment Celeste was documented, undergoing a medical scan inside a hospital? Russell produced the hospital's own security footage and time-stamped records to confirm it beyond any doubt. Celeste told the board plainly that she had grown cruel and had genuinely hurt the assistants who tried to help her, but she refused to let Victor twist her personal failures into proof that she was incapable of leading. A chief executive, she said, could take responsibility, apologize, and change. A fraud could only erase evidence and blame someone else for it. Lenora called for an immediate vote to suspend Victor on the spot. The directors who had once backed him quietly withdrew their support one after another. Investigators and law enforcement, already waiting outside at Russell's request, took Victor away to face charges of fraud, document forgery, tampering with a private medical system, and endangerment. As he was led past Roderick, Victor muttered that the board would never let a man like him rise into their ranks. Lenora heard every word of it. The board voted to permanently dissolve the continuity plan. Celeste's full authority as chief executive was restored without condition. The North Star sale was suspended indefinitely. Every false accusation against the 6 former assistants was formally erased from their records. Lenora turned to Roderick and asked what title he currently held within the company. He answered simply that he was the night assistant, at least until the sun came up that morning. Celeste told the board that Roderick would not be returning to the assistant's desk that night. In the aftermath, Celeste offered Roderick a substantial cash bonus, and he turned it down flatly if it was meant only as gratitude for saving her. He told her he wanted to be judged on his actual operational skill and on what he could build for the company over the long term, not on a single dramatic night. Celeste realized almost for the first time that she had unconsciously treated her assistants as instruments for carrying out orders, rather than as skilled professionals in their own right. After reviewing his prior record and everything he had accomplished across 7 nights, the board formally appointed Roderick as Director of Continuity Operations and Executive Safety. The role placed him in charge of backup systems, personnel safety access control, independent reporting channels, and safeguards against exactly the kind of abuse of power that had nearly destroyed the company from within. He did not receive the position out of pity or because of his relationship with Celeste. He earned it because he had proven across 7 consecutive nights exactly what he was capable of. Celeste met privately with each of the 6 former assistants in turn. She refused to hide behind Victor or her medication as an excuse for what had happened to them. She apologized to each one directly for failing to listen and for allowing them to be harmed under her own roof. The company compensated them, corrected every falsified record, and helped each of them find new positions elsewhere. Quinn agreed to return, though only within the internal audit division, and never again as anyone's personal assistant. Whitaker Systems was rebuilt from the inside out. Every assistant was granted a direct line to an independent ethics board. No single executive was ever again permitted to simultaneously control the chief executive's schedule, medical information security clearance, and system access all at once. The company launched an independent review into discrimination within its own security staff, refusing to let the officers who had handcuffed Roderick become the sole scapegoats for a much larger, systemic failure. Celeste established an employee council focused specifically on disability rights, accessibility, and personal autonomy within the workplace. Beatrice kept her position as building manager, though she began speaking up in meetings far more often than she ever had under Victor's watch, as though the weight of years of silence had finally lifted. Dr. Phoebe was brought on as a permanent consultant to the company's new safety office, tasked with ensuring no executive's private medical information could ever again be quietly rewritten by someone outside her care. Russell, for his part, simply returned to the work he had always done best, though now with the full authority he had been denied for months. Celeste never stood up, and she never miraculously walked again. She simply replaced her old control system with new equipment she personally owned and fully controlled. Whenever she needed assistance, she asked for it directly, instead of letting others decide on her behalf. She returned to running her company with clearer boundaries around her own time and her own privacy. Her strength did not come from any change in her body. It came from refusing to let fear dictate how she treated the people around her ever again. 6 months later, Roderick and Celeste had settled into an equal, genuine partnership. He no longer handled her personal care or her daily routines in any capacity a healthy boundary. They had both quietly agreed was necessary before anything deeper could grow between them. Late one evening, after a meeting had run long, Celeste asked whether he might like to join her for dinner, entirely outside the walls of work. She made a point of telling him it was an invitation, not an order from her office. Roderick smiled and said yes. There was no grand ceremony marking the change, no speech, and no announcement to the rest of the company, only the quiet, steady rhythm of 2 people who had chosen each other after everything else had been stripped away. Roderick still thought sometimes about the 6 badges that had once sat abandoned in that drawer, about the men and women who never got the chance he had been given, and he made certain their names were remembered inside the very policies that now protected everyone who worked there. Celeste, for her part, stopped flinching whenever someone offered to help her, learning at last that accepting a hand did not mean surrendering her own. They returned together to the very penthouse where everything had first begun. The desk that once held 6 abandoned employee badges now displayed a framed set of new safety protocols instead. The clock struck 8 in the evening, the exact hour Roderick had once begun his very first night shift there. Celeste opened the door herself, using a system that answered only to her. Roderick waited for her to move first, his hands nowhere near her chair. She paused in the doorway and asked if he was coming with her. No assistant had lasted a week because none of them had been allowed to succeed. Roderick survived the 7th night, not because he could tolerate Celeste's anger, but because he saw the truth beneath it. He never treated her wheelchair as proof that she was helpless, and he never allowed anyone's prejudice to define his own worth. Celeste kept her company, Roderick, reclaimed his career, and 6 innocent people finally recovered their names. The night shift had been designed to break whoever accepted it. Instead, it exposed the man who had spent 2 years quietly breaking everyone else, and it gave a woman who had never asked for pity, the one thing she had truly needed, all along, the freedom to choose for herself.